People. So let's go ahead and get started here. Apparently this lesson eludes us and it's taken us the better part of a month and several sessions and delays and crises and hostage situations, etc. to get started here. So let's dive right in. Now the two topics you guys are going to be expected to study for tomorrow's quiz are the Age of Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Now, in both cases, you guys don't have that much to know about them. They're very big topics. The Age of Enlightenment was, this huge intellectual movement that involved dozens of prominent philosophers, thinkers, political scientists, economists in Europe. And obviously, each and every one of them has work that, if you just read it alone, it would take you maybe a couple days to get through it. That's despite all the commentary and criticism on the work. And the French Revolution was a massive undertaking that people argue there isn't even just one French Revolution. There's different phases of it. So I'm not saying this to intimidate you guys, but I'm just giving you an idea of the fact that what you're responsible for is really a fraction of this. So I'm really just aiming to get you guys familiar with the basics. So in the case of the Age of Enlightenment, there are, I would say, around 20 or 30 significant scholars that emerged from that period. But we're really just focusing on, I would say, about 4 or 5. Specifically in our case, we're focusing on 4. And they are Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. So each one of these guys had different backgrounds. They had different nationalities. Hobbes and Locke were from the UK. Montesquieu was French, and Rousseau was from Geneva. So each one of them had a very different background, and this background influenced their work. But let's, without further ado, get into what each one of them believed. Now, in the case of Hobbes, Hobbes is most closely linked to the idea of the philosopher king, which in and of itself is an idea that they had in Greek philosophy. What this meant was that he believed there should be someone at the top who is strong, fair, wise, and knowledgeable, and this person should wield all the power. So the idea was, of course, Hobbes believed this was the best way to overcome what he saw as the state of nature. Now, the state of nature, as we understand it, is a bit of an oversimplification. When Hobbes wrote the Leviathan, which is his seminal work, he wasn't just talking about politics and power. It was his own very overarching work about humanity, about people, about human nature. But in that work, one of the most famous aspects, I would say, is that he explained the state of nature. And he kind of outlined it in a way where in the state of nature, everything's chaotic. There's not really any structure. So the long story short is he believed you needed a strong leader at the top, and this strong leader maintains order. So the idea is, of course, that you enter into what's called a social contract with this leader. And as part of the social contract, this is a bit of a paradoxical concept because it's like saying it's democratically giving up your rights. But he kind of phrased it in this way. So he believed that people were cool with it. In his vision, you were ruled over by an absolute monarch, but you were fine with it. You weren't not okay with it because the fact of the matter was you believed that this absolute ruler was guaranteeing that you would have life, and property and safety, etc. So the idea was that you would be kept safe. Now, we move further down the line to, I guess we could talk about Locke. Locke was also English. Now, here's the thing. As we discussed last time, in England, there was a massive event in the 17th century, culminating in 1688, called the English Civil War. Now, what happened was the king, James I, started trying to be more powerful. Now, in the English system, they had the king at the top, but you also had the nobility in what was known as Parliament. So the idea was that power was divided between the two. So James I and later Charles I, his son, started challenging this idea. They wanted to be more absolute. So eventually a civil war breaks out, and after several bloody years of fighting, Charles is executed. Now the idea here is that Charles and James were both, as kings, trying to overstep their boundaries. Now there are different positions. People like Hobbes supported the king. They wanted a strong central leader at the top. People like Locke, who we'll talk about in a little bit, supported the parliament. Now, in Locke's case, Locke believed that human beings are born with inalienable rights, that we have rights to freedom, to liberty, to property, and that the government's job was really just to make sure that those rights weren't trampled on. But that also meant that the government wasn't there to boss us around. It wasn't there to control our lives. It was there to just make sure we didn't harm one another. And the social contract with the government in Locke's case was, you keep me safe and you do what you need to do, but you also make sure that I have my life and I have my liberty and I have my freedom and I have my property, most importantly. And if you don't do that, then you've done a bad job and I will rise against you and I will overthrow you. This was what Locke believed. Locke believed that it was your ruler's job not to lord over you, but rather to make sure that you were kept safe. So he believed that the best kind of government, in his opinion, to paraphrase, should govern lightly. So the government should be there, but the government shouldn't be up in your business trying to control every aspect of your life. That wasn't cool with him. So in that case, we had something more akin to the parliamentary system, constitutional monarchy, as it was called. Constitutional monarchy, meaning you have a monarch, you have a king at the top, but that king's powers are fundamentally limited by a constitution, which is a legal document specifying what the king can and cannot do. So we move on to the Frenchies. Now, Montesquieu was really well liked in the French Revolution, and that's what we'll sort of move on to in a little bit. Montesquieu was very popular as a philosopher. One of the things we didn't cover as much is that Montesquieu himself was kind of an elitist. He didn't believe in power for the people. He believed more in power to be shared between the nobles and the sort of the wealthy land-owning classes and he had the noblesse de race, which were the people who were noble because of their birth, and noblesse de cour, which is basically the nobles of the court, people who had good jobs, and this sort of elevated them to a higher position. So anyway, to summarize Montesquieu's view, Montesquieu believed fundamentally in a balance of power, very similar to what Locke had in mind, but arguably he had it more formalized. So he believed in a government where power was shared between three branches. This was what he called the balance of power. No one person in the government has more power than any other person in the government. They each have separate but equal roles. So essentially, they were the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. The legislative legislates. It comes up with laws. Legislation, laws, legal, legislative. And what happens, of course, is the executive takes decisions. Typically speaking, it can sign laws into effect and it can make the final decision. But the legislative has to approve those laws first. And finally, you have the judicial. And the judicial's job is to read and interpret these laws. And this is typically what you have in the US right now. The US is the best example of a system like that. But of course, most modern Western and even really Eastern and Asian nations that follow this, Montesquieu-based model have this kind of classic division of power. So, moving on. We also have another couple of scholars in France, such as Voltaire and Diderot. We're not going to talk about them as much. The final scholar we want to talk about today is Rousseau. Now, in Rousseau's case, Rousseau believed in total freedom. He believed that you govern yourself. See, he liked the state of nature on some level, and he thought the state of nature was the last time human beings were totally free. And in his opinion, the state of nature was violated by these governments. And he thought the governments were people that came and tried to trick you into giving up your freedom so they could be in charge. So the thing is, in different stages of the revolution, different political thinkers were popular. In the beginning stages, Montesquieu was popular. Now, this was the stage where they still figured, let's keep the king around, but limit his power, like in England. However, the king really didn't want to do that. The king was an absolute monarch. And in his opinion, he was supposed to rule as an absolute monarch. And unfortunately for the king, he behaved very stupidly and tried to run away. They caught him, and this sort of proved to a lot of the French people who were involved in the revolution that, the king's not interested in sharing power with us. So a lot of the more radical French revolutionaries, who we know as republicans today, just wanted to completely abolish the system of having a king. They're like, no king, no more king. It's an antiquated system. We don't want one at all because he's going to be at the top. He's going to want to try and take the power. So that was the idea. And a lot of this is based on Rousseau's ideas. Rousseau's ideas were that we, in the state of nature, were free, and that you should really have total freedom, that any kind of government or overarching power shouldn't really apply. Instead, it should be a purely democratic power. And the social contract, in his opinion, was us working together to form a functional society. Now, Rousseau came from Geneva, and in Geneva, it was a lot easier to see this happening. Geneva was a small city-state, it was prosperous, it was developed, so it was easy to have this system. So the thing you can kind of argue is that Montesquieu was more logical. Montesquieu in his work actually sat down and outlined different kinds of governments, and he said each one works in its own way. He figured for the bigger states, a lot more often it's going to have more logic to have a bigger, more powerful government. For the smaller states, you can have a constitutional monarchy, and for the smallest ones, you can have a direct democracy. He outlined these different kinds of leadership. But in Rousseau's case, he believed in total freedom of the people. Purely democratic system, purely based on the sovereignty. Sovereignty means the power and decision-making of the people. Now, how does this tie in with the French Revolution? Well, see, the thing is, the French Revolution wasn't just based on the Enlightenment. But the French Revolution came at a time where there were struggling harvests. King Louis XVI's authoritarian regime was seen as being wasteful. The French crown had bankrupted the nation by supporting the American Revolution and helping the Americans achieve their vision of freedom and liberty and equality, and yet their own people had absolutely no political representation. So yes, a lot of these revolutionaries were middle-class intellectuals, and they were middle-class intellectuals who read Montesquieu, who read Rousseau. Funnily enough, a lot of them hadn't actually read that much of their work because this is a lot to get through, but many of them had heard of their work and many of them supported them. In Rousseau's case, his work, The Social Contract, wasn't as popular as his other work, Confessions, but people still liked and supported his ideas. Rousseau was actually very popular with Republican French revolutionaries, guys who believed in pure democracy. They actually brought his remains from where he was buried into Paris to be buried in the capital at the height of the revolution. So what happened, of course, in the revolution, story that's been told a million times, you had three estates, three social classes that were recognized in France. The first estate, which was the clergy, the second estate, which was the nobility. Like we said, there were two kinds: nobles who were land-owning, who were wealthy, who came from good families, and nobles who were people that had high-class, fancy jobs. And finally, of course, you had the peasants. Now, among the peasants, you had what were known as the bourgeoisie. These were the people that lived in the cities. Well, Paris was mainly it. You had some smaller cities in other parts of France, but Paris was really the heart of it. And these people were the ones that were educated, they were middle class, and they were very active. So the idea is that these middle class revolutionaries would eventually push to the king's direction, and they would say, listen, we want to be part of the process. He would form the Estates General. Now, the Estates General was essentially a sort of parliament where new laws could be discussed. Now, the idea was, of course, that he figured he had tricked them because the Estates General, 3 votes, right? So that means that the first estate gets 1 vote, the second estate gets 1 vote, third estate, well, you can do the math. But the problem was that the first and second estate were barely 10% of the population, and the third estate was 90% of the population, which meant it was an unfair, undemocratic system in their mind. So they get locked out of the chambers, and they assume that this means that they were actually being kicked out of the Estates General after they protested the king that they want it to be more fair and more equal. And what happens is in the tennis court of Versailles, the palace, they take an oath that they want to keep meeting in this tennis court and keep protesting until their needs are met. The king, realizing that things aren't going well, and of course finding out that there are riots in Paris and that the Bastille prison is broken into and taken apart brick by brick, decides that he is going to relent. He allows them to form the National Assembly, and they start working towards a new system where the people and the king share power. The problem is that the king wasn't such a big fan of this National Assembly system, and in many cases, he was kind of trying to make sure that he wasn't overwhelmed, but at the same time, he thought maybe he could navigate in a smart way and take power back. And this would be his undoing. Now, for the quiz, you guys aren't really responsible for the later phases of the revolution. You really just have to know the story up until the National Assembly and what caused it. Now, in regards to the Enlightenment, really it's as simple as saying the Enlightenment provided these ideas which motivated the revolutionaries. And on top of that, it provided a diverse group of ideas. There wasn't just one Enlightenment thinker. There were several key Enlightenment thinkers. You had Enlightenment thinkers that believed we should have a strong man at the top. You have Enlightenment thinkers who believed power should be shared. Some who thought there should be a complex balance of power system, and some who believed, you know what, nobody at the top. Democracy, everyone has a voice, everyone has a role in it. And of course, respectively, the one believing that there should be a strong, forceful leader at the top, Hobbes. The one believing in a more balanced system of constitutional monarchy, Locke. The one believing in a complex government based on a system of balancing power, Montesquieu. And of course, the one who believed in complete democracy and who believed in a system where the people were the sovereigns was Rousseau. So thank you guys very much and good luck.